we have a result. Donald Trump will be returning to the White House. And there's a lot to be said here. What I'm going to do is break down the 10 reasons why we got here. And the reason why I focus on the 10 reasons why we got here is, in particular, I want to focus on what Democrats could do differently. I come from the Democratic tradition. I've worked in Democratic campaigns, and this is a conversation that I've long tried to play a part in, and I want to do so with the full humility that I didn't get everything right this cycle by any means. And so everything I say here is done in a spirit, hopefully, of humility. I also want to add that as a former boss used to tell me, you're never as smart as people think you are when you win, and you're never as dumb as people think you are when you lose. And I think this applies to both sides of the equation. Not everything Democrats or Harris did was wrong, and not everything that Trump and Republicans did was right, even effective, right? And so we need to resist simplistic explanations here. And I also don't want to limit my analysis here to Harris and her campaign. I think Harris and her campaign are a symptom of something larger. And in many cases, they probably did better than a lot of people were expecting. The things I'm talking about in this video, for the most part, predate anything that happened in this campaign. And so I don't want to lay most of the blame on her at her feet or on that in her campaign's feet. This stuff goes back a lot. So let's start with reason number one why we got here. The inability of the Biden administration and the Harris campaign and the larger Democratic apparatus to tell a story about the economy. There's an old adage that if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that is an old and outdated way of thinking about things. The corollary here is that you can't educate the electorate. And I heard this time and time again, even from people I totally respect a ton about politics, people like David Axelrod, my former boss. Basically, we're advising Democrats that you shouldn't be trying to educate the electorate on how the economy is doing. This is not the video or the podcast for this, but I've long talked about how I personally think that the metrics here were very favorable for a story about an economic recovery. Low unemployment, high GDP growth, inflation coming down, after inflation, wealth accumulation for certain key segments of the society, improvements in the manufacturing base, all better relative to when Trump left office, which is obviously a complicated picture given COVID, but also most importantly, better than any equivalent other country right now, other economically developed country out there. And most of the non-developed countries out there, the US is doing particularly well. But Democrats, Harris, Biden, have been reticent to talk about that because they didn't want to seem out of touch with the electorate. And what wound up happening was they created a vacuum where Republicans were talking about how bad the economy was, how bad crime was, even though crime was at record low this year. And even the traditional media that in some cases tends to lean Democratic for huge periods of time in this election season was talking about how the vibes were bad, the feelings were bad, even as a lot of the economic data coming in said otherwise. So I think this was a mistake not to really sell the results here of what appears to be a historic soft landing. And I think there's a way to do that without seeming out of touch. And I think that was true also on the crime equation. The alternative theory here is that Democratic policies were just bad and there was no way to fix them. I certainly am going to engage with our audience on that theory throughout the course of this administration, the Trump administration, and comparing his policies to the Harris-Biden policies. That is beyond the scope of this video. I'm not sold on that, but I'm definitely willing to have that debate. Reason two why we're here, the process around Biden's exit and Harris's selection was incredibly damaging. And I mean Harris's selection both as vice president, but then as the nominee. I think Harris really struggled because she was sold originally as a vice presidential choice on identity grounds. Biden essentially said, I'm going to pick a woman and at various points a woman of color, which meant that no matter who Harris was or what her background was, the electorate, certain segments of the electorate were going to view her as a identity politics candidate, as the Trump campaign called her a DEI candidate. And you can hate that framing, But Biden himself used some versions of that framing early on, and I think it really undermined Harris. I had major questions of whether she was the right person to be selected as vice president, but it's besides the point. She never had a chance given that framing. And then you fast forward to Biden dragging his feet, not exiting the race, all the damage that did, and then selecting Harris without a primary. The combination of the way she was sold originally with the way that she was selected as the nominee meant that I think for a lot of people, it created an opening for the Trump campaign to say she never earned it. And I think that message resonated a lot for people. And it made it really hard for her. I think they did a pretty admirable effort in many ways, despite any of the criticism I level in this video of mounting a quick campaign, but it was really hard. I also think that this interstitial period with Biden thinking he was going to run for president meant that throughout a huge swath of his presidency, he was running for reelection. And this was like a laughably long period of time in which he was viewing everything he did through the prism of reelection. He was in campaign mode the entire time, which means I think they didn't take risks. They didn't govern effectively at various points. Their attention was split at various points, and you had a guy who is incredibly old and inarticulate and had low stamina in many ways, with divided attention, but also a divided strategy, where at times what was best for governing was not best for the campaign. And I think this is exemplified by something I saw a little while ago when former Obama strategist Jim Messina, who was involved in the sort of PAC efforts for Harris, went on Tim Miller's podcast. And here's what he had to say.
I'm doing all these international elections all over the world. And after one of them, I flew last summer to the Biden White House and said, look, immigration is killing incumbents all over the world. And if you guys don't start dealing with this, you're toast next year. And they patted me on the head and said, every day we're talking about immigration, we're losing. We're not going to talk about it. And I think the Harris campaign knows that was exactly wrong. And they've got to persuade these voters she gets it on immigration so they can go back to doing what they really want to do, which is vote against Donald Trump.
And so you hear it here, right? Every day we're talking about immigration, we're losing. Well, losing what? You know, that was last summer. You're president of the United States, right? You need to be talking about the problems facing this country and solving them. Yes, you got to round to some sensible solutions like the bipartisan border deal that Trump tanked, but you got around to it late, and your calculus was very transparently re-election. It was obvious to everybody. And that's not just true. You know, he gives Harris credit and her campaign for eventually coming around to this, but Harris herself was in the administration, and for being honest, deserves a lot of the blame there. Reason number 3 here, gender identity politics. Now, I talked about this last week with Isaac from Tangle, but the message out there was very simplistic when it comes to gender on both sides of the equation. On the one side of the equation was the message to women, which was very Dobbs focused. And look, that might have been right. That might have been the best they could hope. It was a simple message. And they had a lot of evidence from 2022 to suggest that message would be really effective. I think in hindsight, we should examine that and say, was that enough? Right? Because they didn't, there's a lot of parsing of the data going on right now. But it seems like their margins with women were about the same this cycle as they were last time. But they lost a tremendous amount of ground with men. And that their gains with women were largely with higher education, higher propensity women voters who I'm not sure how much educating they need on the question of Dobbs. I'm not sure that a lot of the messaging from Harris towards the end of this campaign really did a lot with that group of voters. But certainly they lost a lot of ground with men. And at various points in this campaign, their message was often have the backs of the women in your life, right? Which I like that sentiment. I hope I tried to vote in a way that had the back of women in my life, but I'm not sure for an undecided voter, somebody who's a Kamala skeptic, I'm not sure that won over a lot of those young men. Obama said something equivalent to this. He says, women in our lives have been having our backs the entire time. When we get in trouble and the system isn't working for us, they're the ones out there marching and protesting. Uh, that's great. First of all, that's a very limited group that Obama is speaking to, right? How many people out there actually have women in their lives out there marching and protesting? Yeah, like if you're in the suburbs of Bucks County or Westchester or the Upper West Side, yeah, maybe the women in your lives are showing up to the Women's March, right? But if you're in Jackson, Mississippi, or if you're in Franklin, Tennessee, right? Is that how you think of the women in your life, or do you think of them as wife, mother, coworker, colleague, um, you know, member of your parish, right? I think it was a limited view, and there's a real crisis going on here for men that could have been spoken to more effectively in this race. Yes, Harris at some points was giving lip service to these talking points, but it wasn't a prominent part of the campaign. And what I'm talking about here is stuff that people like Richard Reeves have pointed out: the mental health crisis among men, high suicide rates, the lower relative employment, the lower college grading going rates. Like there's a greater gender gap in college going rates than any time since 1972, and there's a larger high school GPA gap. There's a real crisis for young men out there. Harris really, she didn't make this a prominent part of her campaign, any appeal to young men, and she explicitly and bafflingly avoided certain major forums out there, like the Rogan podcast, which yes is the biggest podcast in the world, that has a largely young male audience. She avoided a lot of those audiences and didn't take advantage of forums to push a message that she cared about those types of voters, and I think that was a huge mistake. Um, Reason number 4 is racial identity politics. So the cousin of the gender identity politics point here is the fact that Democrats, and I've been talking about this for a while, have been for too long treating Hispanic voters as single issue voters on immigration. This is something I saw in Pennsylvania in 2022 when I visited the state during that midterm election. I talked to a business owner who was like, I'm sick of Democrats just talking to me about like immigration and assuming I want more immigration in the way that they want it. I'm a small business owner. I want lower taxes and lower regulation. They also talk to communities of color like the only thing they care about is racism, right? I'm a brown person. Yes, I don't want, I want solutions to what I do think is some entrenched racism in this country. I was a school principal for Black students in North Nashville, in the district in this country with the largest incarceration rate of Black males in this country. And I don't think that the inequities throughout this country, and in particular in the South, are random, right? I think there are real historical racial injustices that are still playing out till this day. But Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people are not just their race. And their race is complicated. How they view their race is complicated. And the simplistic stories that Democrats have been telling for too long, um, I think really came back to haunt them here. I saw DeRay McKesson tweet out just before I went to this podcast that one of the lessons of this race is that too many Black and Latino voters, or I think he might have said Black voters, think of themselves as white. And I'm like, that's a crazy thing to say in response to this election, that what they think of themselves as white. No, they think of themselves as Americans. They think of themselves as business owners, as Christians, as family members, as fathers, mothers, brothers, right? They're no one thing. And it's the Democrats who've been treating them as one thing. And I think it would be a profound mistake to take DeRay's conclusion from this race. Um, Reason number 5 here: there's been a total lack of accountability within the Democratic Party establishment, from the media to the campaign apparatuses here. You got people running campaigns who are at the center of the party, who know they can traffic in bad ideas and lie to their supporters without any accountability. This was true, obviously, of the selling of Biden's age, right? You've got people out there who were lying to us pretty consistently about Biden's condition and then telling us to get in line after we saw that travesty on the debate stage. People like Bakari Sellers, who still is on, I think he's either on CNN or MSNBC. People like Molly Jong-Fast, who's a friend of mine, but who, these people like on Morning Joe, who time and again are telling us not to believe our eyes. and they continue to have prominent roles within this campaign. I'm watching campaign coverage on the eve of the election, and these panels are packed with people who've been totally dishonest with their viewership and with the electorate about what's been going on here. And that's also true of people who had prominent roles within the campaigns, right? I talked about Anita Dunn, who, by some reporting, had a major role in the largest PAC for Biden, which I think made some baffling decisions at various points. She's somebody out there who was, a key figure in the cover up for Biden to the very end, and who, after all the changes were made, still seemed to have an axe to grind and didn't seem to learn the right lessons. Um, and and I want to practice total transparency here. I got a lot of friends who are involved in this, and I mention these things in total good faith, and knowing that I haven't been right about everything, but I do think we all need to start getting more accountable. I think a good example of this are my friends over at Crooked Media. I've collaborated with them. I launched a podcast with them earlier this year, about India, and I've been, friends with these guys for a long time. But I think, and I'm grateful that they came around on the Biden age question after once the debate happened. But even for folks like that, there are a lot of folks out there, like the Crooked guys, who I think have major credibility questions coming out of this race. And a good example is the very question of Biden's age. Those guys attended a fundraiser with Biden on June 15th. And then on June 24th, got on the podcast, and my friend John Favreau got on and said, defended Biden's condition. He says he's an old school politician. He tells a lot of stories and goes on forever. And that has nothing to do with age. He's been doing it for decades. And this is in a long series of statements that Favreau had been making, and the guys on the podcast have been saying that, look, yeah, Biden might be slipping a little bit here and there, but there's nothing to be alarmed at here. That was June 24th, by the way, what I just said, which was after the fundraiser. Then we had the Biden debate performance. And then on June 28th, Favreau gets on and says, me and Tommy and Lovett, we went to a fundraiser in LA with President Obama and Jimmy Kimmel. And Biden was very much like he was tonight at the fundraiser. So they admitted that in this private setting, 2 weeks earlier, they saw Biden in the same condition he was at the debate stage. They didn't share that with their audience. And I think this is really important, because they only had a come to Jesus moment with their audience once it was their audience was operating with the same information they had, right? The fundraiser was private. So there was no need to say to the audience, hey, we're really alarmed here, and speak truth to their audience. They only, came clean with their audience once the audience saw the very thing they saw, which was the debate performance. And I think I don't need to go through all of their statements over the years, but over the course of the past 2 years, they have been part of the gaslighting experience just as much as many of the people who were the worst offenders after the Biden debate performance. I think there's a special and vigorous amount of accountability that we need to bring to the people who continued to lie to the American public and Democrats after the Biden debate performance. But there was a whole lot of bad that happened before that. And in case you're wondering, for folks who are not regular listeners, I don't deserve a medal for this, but I've been long calling for Biden to not run, before the primary, early in the primary, on an ongoing basis, and did so with a lot of heat from some of my Democratic audience, both on this podcast and elsewhere. Don't deserve a medal for that. There are plenty of things I've gotten wrong, but just mentioning that just in case people are wondering when I came to Jesus on that. Reason number 6 here, there is an addiction to quick fixes and to slogans. The Bragg case in New York is a great example of this. I was an advisor to Bragg. I supported Bragg as the Manhattan DA candidate, but I think he made a tremendous mistake. He bowed to pressure in bringing the series of cases against Trump in Manhattan. And he was pressured by his Democratic base. I honestly think that he was going to face a realistic primary if he didn't reverse course. He originally didn't want to bring the Trump case, but he reversed course and brought that case against people. But then when he brought that case, there was so much celebrating online. Finally, Trump is going to be held accountable. And I tweeted at the time, hey, this is not going to be the panacea you think it's going to be. And I also wrote throughout the course of that entire case that I thought it was a mistake, and that I actually think Democrats bent their principles in bringing that case, because they wouldn't have brought it against anybody else. and that Bragg himself should have recused from that case because he made statements on the campaign trail that I think indicated some bias. Uh, I have other feelings about the federal cases and the Georgia case, which I actually think are valid. So I'll put those aside. But there was this sense out there that there was going to be one solution to Trump. But as hopefully is obvious by the things I've said here, the issues and solutions to Trump are deeper than any one quick fix. I mentioned slogans. You know, we had defund the police, abolish ICE. We had a lot of these sloppy slogans that were deeply unpopular with the American public. And people were shifty about these slogans. I heard Rahm Emanuel talk about this recently where he said, you know, often when he would criticize defund the police, people would be like, that's not actually what we mean. We don't actually mean defund the police. We mean reallocate it to this or that or whatever. And he'd say, well, if that's not what you mean, that shouldn't be the slogan. Slogans shouldn't require a paragraph after them. And the literal meaning of the slogan shouldn't be something deeply unpopular with the American public. And by the way, deeply unpopular with the very communities of color that you claim to speak for, right? Like in a lot of cases here, the defunding the police was deeply unpopular with communities of color, but you had, yes, some white affluent liberals who were projecting onto the party what they felt should have happened. Reason number 7, there was a general risk aversion within the Harris campaign and before her, the Biden campaign. Her language just felt overwritten and platitudinal throughout most of this campaign. There were some exceptions, like I think her appearance on the Call Her Daddy podcast was authentic. But by and large, we should have learned in 2016 that regardless of what you think about Trump, that there was an appetite out there for authenticity. We could debate how authentic Trump is or not. That's for another day. But I think the standard bromide-driven campaigns out there, even the very best ones of them, like the Obama campaign, which I think was more like fresh and new and exciting, but still, you know, was using this soaring rhetoric that was like more like Ted Sorensen, JFK style than anything we see today. We should know that those days are gone, right? But too often the messages coming out of this campaign felt stale, felt overwritten, felt overly general. And there was this sense out there to this risk aversion point to just do safe audiences. There were certain exceptions here, like Fox News, which I think came too late. But this is best encapsulated by the decision to go on the Brene Brown podcast instead of the Rogan podcast, right? This was all happening simultaneously. I don't think and I said this at the time, I don't think there's a single person who listens to Brene Brown's podcast who wasn't already a Harris voter. Whereas Rogan's podcast, the biggest in the world, you know, tens and tens of millions of Trump-leaning young men who had low favorables of Harris. I think her favorables with that audience are something like 10 to 15%, whereas Trump's favorables are 70%. There was a risk aversion at the end of this campaign. Didn't want to go to that podcast. Instead, opted to do one rally after another, repeating the same unmemorable speech. And that was a huge mistake. She could have gone on a podcast where people would have given her credit for going into the lion's den. She could have spoken for hours off the cuff and probably said something interesting. Yeah, certain things that could have been taken out of context or that were dumb or whatever. But you got to let it fly at that point. Do I think doing Rogan would have won her this election? Yeah, it's highly unlikely. But doing more things like that, yes, would have introduced her to the American public in a different way. And she could have, you know, there are certain answers out here that you just never got a really concrete and crisp answer. Like, why have your positions changed? Right. And she would give like a sort of platitudinal answer to this. My values haven't changed. You know, my positions haven't changed. My values haven't changed. But then again, there wasn't a clear distillation of the values and anything really compelling. But also, there could have been a more extended, real answer here, which could have been a combination of, hey, I've been vice president. I'm representing more of the country, not just California, which, if we're honest, is a pretty liberal place. But now I represent everywhere. I represent Wright County, Iowa. I represent Lafayette County, Mississippi, right? I represent all those people, and I need to learn from them, and I need to change my positions to represent more of those people. And then the second thing, which is something Trump would have said, which is, I'm running for president. I want to win, right? Let me just be candid about that. Everybody knows that's what she's doing. Just say it, right? but too often there was a risk aversion there. I think the biggest risk aversion here came, and I don't claim to have really forcefully pushed this idea at the time, but RFK Jr. being up for grabs. I think the shunning of RFK Jr. probably was a mistake. If he was, to the extent he was gettable, it seems like Trump got him without promising an explicit post within the administration. Obviously, he was more concrete about that towards the end of the campaign. But uh, if she could have gotten RFK into her camp by just promising an amorphous advisory role, that seems like it would have been worth it, right? Because right now what you have is Trump plus RFK anyway, right? And I think treating RFK and his supporters as a coalition, like it's a parliamentary election, probably would have been smart. Look, I don't agree with a lot of what RFK has to say. I don't agree with his misuse of science, in my opinion, and I don't agree with a lot of the conclusions he comes to. But you have to play uh, hardball coalition politics to win. Um, Reason number 8 is stodgy campaign tactics. There was a lot of micro targeting out here. We were hearing a lot of this ad tested well, but in a lot of cases here, what was happening was the PACs and the campaign were running ads that probably tested well in isolation. Like you show it to a focus group, they tell you in that moment that it's persuasive, but they weren't stitching together a story through all these ads and all these appearances that was compelling to the American public. I remember this reminded me of the 2007, 2008 primary campaign, where when I was on the Obama campaign, that was very much a sweeping narrative campaign. And the Clinton campaign was a micro targeting campaign under Mark Penn, where they were trying to go after subgroups, but never really stitched together a compelling sweeping narrative. I'll come back to that in a second. Reason number 9, this is an easy one. Too many celebrities. Towards the end of this campaign, every appearance was Fat Joe this and Oprah that. And I don't think this is a big deal one way or the other, but I do think towards the end of this campaign, I was watching these rallies and I'm like, man, it seems like there's this like party with a bunch of elites going on, which is the narrative the Republicans have been pushing for a long time. And it's a party you're not kind of invited to, right? It's like this, it fits within the stereotype that Democrats are just a bunch of out of touch Hollywood and New York elites. Obviously, the rejoinder to this is that Trump was hanging around with the richest guy in the world, Elon Musk, and was dragging around a bunch of B-list celebrities like Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock. But again, we'll talk about Trump. I have been talking about Trump. We'll put those people aside for now. I'm talking about just what Democrats can do to be the best version of themselves. And then reason number 10, which I think is the most important reason of all that we lost, and I alluded to this before, which is there really was a lack of vision and story from Democrats. John Gantz wrote this morning that a dark vision beats no vision at all. And MAGA was a vision. It's always been a vision. It's a story with a hero, Donald Trump, and puts you at the center of the story. You are the hero of the story. You are the aggrieved, and you are also the hero. There are real heroes and villains, right? The villains are us, the libs, and all the assortment of different characters that they've been able to villainize over the course of this. And it has an arc to it, right? It has a place it's going to take you to, or they claim that they want to take you to, right? That's been their narrative. And JD Vance had his own spin on that, right? The hillbilly elegy narrative was upgraded for MAGA, and they told that story about the forgotten places as well. We did not have an equivalent story. Try to tell yourself what really was the story here of this election coming from the Harris campaign. And I do think that there's room here moving forward to craft that vision. And I don't have it all spelled out today, but I'll just tell you some things that are on my mind that I would include as part of that vision and I would roll up as part of that vision. Number 1, I would want Democrats to talk about government that does less, but does it extremely well, right? Like any person or company out there, right? If your friend comes to you and is like, I want to start 10 new ventures, or companies out there and says, I want to have Time Warner is like this. I want to have like 20 verticals, right? When you look at Time Warner versus Netflix, which is like, I'm going to do this one thing really well. Netflix does that one thing really well, better than Time Warner does any of its things. Obviously, when you're government, you don't have the luxury of doing only one thing, but you could do fewer things. What would those fewer things be for me? Well, I would do things like make Medicaid excellent, truly excellent, like walking into the Mayo Clinic. I would make public schools sparkling, beautiful institutions that are innovative, ambitious, excellent, and accountable. We've talked a lot on this podcast what that can look like. We'll talk about it more. I would want prisons that are safe and rehabilitative, right? So that people aren't raped in prison, they're not assaulted in prison, and that when they're coming out of prison better than they came in, so that they're less likely to commit crimes. I can go on. For everything we do really well, we have to be able to say there are things that we can no longer do. And that means taking a serious look at the 140,000 plus pages of the federal regulatory codes and the many, many dumb local and state laws out there that are standing in the way of businesses and innovation and people flourishing, right? Uh, right now, a lot of people who are out there, um, even if they're Democratic leaning voters in urban areas, I see this in New York. When they think of the brand of the Democratic Party, they think of people like the San Francisco School Board, which dragged its feet to reopen those schools. We did a whole series on that in comical ways. Uh, they think of the Democratic School Board. They think of the lead-footed mayor of Chicago, who's totally mismanaging that city. They think of Eric Adams and his comical corruption, right? We're not known for a competent stewardship of cities right now. And this was a big issue that was true of the Democrats in the 70s and 80s, which is why the Republicans dominated at the national level that period of time. You need to show competence, right? And for all the, I think, revisionism of Bill Clinton, one of the reasons why Bill Clinton rescued the party out of that period of time was that he had this technocratic, I'm going to solve problems approach that came with a real track record in Arkansas. And so I don't want people at the local level to associate Democrats with just another party that wants to raise your taxes and increase regulation, right? That's how even people who support Democrats think of Democrats. And that's why you saw a 10-point shift in New York, is that people are getting fed up with that. In New York, for example, you have to hire expensive consultants to pay for all kinds of bullshit to open any kind of small business like a gym, right? Just to like wade through all the regulations. And some of my friends have pegged the compliance alone for like starting like your average CrossFit gym to over $100,000, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars. This was, comically portrayed in The Bear, the show set in Chicago. When they're trying to open their restaurant, they're like, did you get the consultant to the consultant to the consultant to open this restaurant? Because you need the permit to get the permit to get the other permit. This is people's experience right now with Democrats, and we need to fix that. And there are bright spots. There are people like Jared Polis in Colorado who has had a freedom agenda where he connects everything from reproductive freedom to gay rights to lower taxes to free range parenting, right? Trying to do less but do it better, right? That could be the narrative of the Democratic Party, and then you can inspire people, right? You could talk about what it means to be an American in a way that Obama did, right? That Kamala came to really late. It was just too late, right? This idea that we're not a black America or a white America, right? We're not red, blue, and really show that you can be that, right? You can be inclusive. You can have an open door, right? You're not quick to take offense, right? You're somebody who's not going to who's not going to treat people like the worst thing they've ever said or done. You're not going to take things out of context. You're not going to do the equivalent of political flopping every time somebody says something that could conceivably offend somebody, even if it doesn't offend you, even if it sounds like something your grandparents say, or even your parents say, or even you said 10 years ago, right? Like, we need to have a more open tent. We need to have an inclusive vision of this country. We need to be more forward looking. We need to inspire people. And yes, like, I have a lot to say about how exclusive Trump's vision of America is, and how he talks about Democrats and libs and people like me, and doesn't have a seat at the table for people like me, and all the other flaws I think he has and his coalition has. And they'll be right in this position in 4 years if they don't fix those flaws. But Democrats have a lot to answer for there, and I think they have the playbook, right? There's a lot we could do here, both from learning from inspiring leaders today, but also imagining what better versions of those leaders could be in the future. So we'll have a lot more to say here. Less I told you so here, but more just good faith. Like, let's have a good conversation about two parts. Number one, what Democrats could do differently on all the fronts that we have here. Obviously, feel free to push back on anything I said here. And then number two is we'll start to have a meaningful conversation about what the Trump administration and the future of Trumpism looks like there. Hopefully, also with humility, right? Those of you who support him, like, let's not get carried away here, right? Like, I would hope you see some risks in him and his presidency that we can have an honest conversation about. And in exchange, I will view Trump with as open a mind as I possibly can muster, and will do everything I can to give him credit for anything he does that is sound. So with that, I'm signing off today, and we'll have a lot more to say in the coming weeks.